Hello everyone, and welcome back to Autonomia, the show where we bring ideas from the libertarian left to everyday people, and foster conversation on what we believe in hopes of proving that we all have far more in common than we are trained to believe. My name is Hayward, and I am your host. As always, our intro and outro music come from a song called A Bigger Cage is Still a Prison by System Failure. If you'd like to look up this song, the band spells System, C-I-S-T-E-M, for political reasons.
There's nothing I want more than to sleep under the night sky, hear the animals as they go about their lives, feel the fire warm my body, feel the mud under my toes, but tonight this cell keeps me enclosed.
Hey everyone, and thank you so much for tuning back in. I have sort of an unusual episode for today. Mostly that is because I just got back from traveling to St. Louis, and on my way out there and on my way back, I was surprised by a number of things, and I think they are part of the puzzle towards solving why there is so much distance between what you might consider the left and the right when it comes to issues of climate, and how that left-right paradigm tends to break down geographically. And what made this whole thing pop up in my mind is the subject of roadkill. Yes, roadkill, animals that have been killed by vehicles on the side of the road. Once I got to about Pennsylvania, I noticed an unbelievable amount of roadkill pretty much the entire way from Pennsylvania to St. Louis, and on the way back from St. Louis up through Niagara Falls and down through upstate New York back into my part of the world. So, what does an enormous amount of roadkill tell us? Well, I come from an area where, while we do have forests and trees and a great number of other things, we're very densely populated, which is to say we have a lot of green spaces, but they are unbelievably bisected, dissected, trisected, and every other possible section by roads, houses, neighborhoods, industrial infrastructure, cities, whatever. We don't have a lot of enormous continuous green space in our part of the country. And the roadkill is what sort of made me focus in on that. We probably don't have in New England the same amount of sheer biomass running around because we've been colonized since the 1700s or so. And so perhaps we have a more immediate sense of the oncoming climate crisis. Perhaps we see it as more understandable that humans can have an impact on their biosphere because we have been for quite some time. When we get into parts of the country that have been settled by colonists for less time, there's more forest out there, there's more undeveloped space, and by consequence, there's more nature running around, and there's more nature getting murdered by cars. So, taking this into the context of, generally speaking, rural folks leaning more right, and right generally being more skeptical of climate change and other anthropogenic effects on our environment, maybe it's because they mostly live in areas where that effect hasn't had as many hundreds of years to occur. And by extension, it's hard to imagine that driving all of these big trucks and gas-guzzling vehicles around is going to have an effect because you don't live in an area that is quite so thoroughly dominated by industrial civilization. And what does that mean? You can hear data about global climate trends, and you can see some incredibly terrifying numbers, and you can see that something is at least happening according to the numbers, but very easily hand wave it away because you are surrounded by beautiful, bountiful nature. You are surrounded by an ecosystem that, while in a state of decay, is not remotely as bad off as more urban areas of the world. Conversely, you can see those same numbers if you are generally a left-leaning person in a more developed area and say, oh my God, everything's falling apart. There are no more bugs anymore. There are far less birds. I don't see any birds. There are far less animals. I don't see any animals on the road. Keep in mind that for most of us, the interactions we have with wild animals are probably limited to mostly roadkill. So how does that shape your psychology, and how does that shape how willing you are to explore the ideas that humans are creating a devastating effect on our surroundings? I happen to think that if you are in a rural area, you're probably going to be more skeptical of that because you don't see the front end of it. And if you're in an urban area, you're absolutely going to be much more willing to accept it because you live in an area so thoroughly decimated and devastated that it's hard to deny humans' ability to change their circumstances and their climate. And it's much easier then to take the next step and say, well, if we've been doing this for God knows how many hundreds of years now, maybe we are having an effect on broader systems that we don't yet fully understand. Keep in mind that the food chain used to be one of the ways that people explored and understood the natural balance. Now we think of it as more of a food web, and we talk about the web of life. We talk about keystone species. And that's because there are so many layers of interdependency and so many layers of relationships between animals in the biosphere that we can't always understand how individual losses or changes in circumstance are going to play out. So we have a very complex situation, and it's really hard unless you are a specialist, and even then it's tough to grasp the enormity of what we're playing with here. And if your surroundings with which you interact with the world seem to contradict with that understanding, and especially if we talk about the law of diminishing baselines, which is to say, you look around in all of your life, that is your experience for what abundancy is. And so if it's dropped a little bit, but there's still plenty around relative to your personal experience, it doesn't matter that hundreds of years ago there are reports of rivers so full of fish that you could walk across them, or migrating birds so dense that they block out the sun for hours at a time. That sort of diversity, which we don't have for maybe some reason, it's harder to grapple with if your baseline, at least for the modern standard, is pretty abundant. Like, I went through these parts of the country and said, wow, this is an unbelievably lush and abundant place, but compared to what it was before colonialism, who knows? So anyway, New England, at least southern New England, pretty thoroughly decimated by the process of colonization and industrialization. And so we're in a spot right now where life is very steeply depleted. And so it's easier for us to contend with the idea that something might be happening, and it's easier for us to engage with the idea that there may be complex systems that are being messed with here. And I just think that's harder to do if you're surrounded by, relative to modern standards, a lot of life. What to do about this is, well, anyone's guess. And of course, I may be just talking crazy talk here. Maybe I just don't understand. But I thought it was an interesting thing to explore, and I thought maybe we can figure something out from this. Maybe we can continue this thought experiment and try to figure out some way of making sure that we have a planet that doesn't get consumed by wildfires, droughts, dust bowls, and famine. I happen to think that that's a preferable option. We know that we can massively change our circumstances around us by thinking about the Dust Bowl, which is to say the original Dust Bowl, where farming techniques across the American prairies were disturbing the natural abundance and natural balance of the surrounding ecosystem, and they lost something like 9 feet of topsoil to just blowing away and, covering New York with dust. Think about that. Think about how long it takes to accumulate nutritious topsoil, and think about if you mess with that soil, what sort of effects might happen. And again, this is just another hint that things may be getting changed in ways that are beyond our current understanding, and the effects may be beyond our current imagination. One of the things that I tell people when they talk about climate change, and I did bring this up during the rally in which Marjorie Taylor Greene was the headline speaker, some of the people with me acknowledged pollution and said pollution is a real problem, but global warming is not a problem. And I said, you may be right, but perhaps you could consider, if humans are able to mess up their surroundings through pollution and those effects are global, does it not then stand to reason that we could, through hundreds of years of pumping a gas into the atmosphere that wasn't previously there, could we somehow change that in the same way? Could we not also consider carbon dioxide, methane, other industrial byproducts as a form of pollution that could then have an effect on the world itself? Maybe that could be a productive line of reasoning. Maybe it's better instead to talk about how Exxon had its own scientists studying climate change in the 70s and came to some pretty jarring results, and instead decided to bury the report and do whatever they could to fund climate change denial for the next 30 years so they could continue their profits. There is a Behind the Bastards episode on this called, I believe it's How Exxon Murdered the World, or something along those lines, that really gets into the nuts and bolts of that angle of how the climate change and ecology debate has been influenced by enormous powers over the years who have a vested interest in things staying exactly the same. Worth exploring. Anyways, I just wanted to get that out there and explore it in the hopes of maybe getting into a deeper dialogue in the future. There is a person I would very much like to speak to about soil health, and I'm hoping I can get them on the podcast sometime in the near future. So now what I'd like to discuss is something you could say is near and dear to my heart, by which I mean the Second Amendment, and by extension a little bit the First Amendment as well. It is near and dear to my heart because as a student of history, I firmly believe that an empowered working class and an empowered general population is a strong barrier toward the encroaching efforts of tyrannical forces within our society. You can look all back through history and see evidence of poor working class people, oppressed people, racial minorities, cultural minorities, religious minorities, using some variation of the right to bear arms to ensure their self-determination and withstand the forces of tyranny. A great example of that, in my opinion, would be the Black Panthers using their constitutional right to bear arms to deter racist vigilantes and racist police from attacking and persecuting people in their neighborhoods. Keep in mind, this was the late 60s, a very racially tumultuous time where it was very common to see police outright assaulting people of color who were getting just a little bit too uppity. Interestingly enough, the Reagan administration, and when I say Reagan, I mean Governor Reagan of California before he was the President Reagan of the United States, he teamed up with a little group known as the National Rifle Association to pass the Mulford Act, which banned open carry in California, which was blatantly obvious at the time to be directed at the Black Panthers. So whenever people started to use their Second Amendment as intended, the government got really touchy about this. Interesting thing to keep in your head. Keep in mind, of course, also that the labor movement saw unbelievable repression not only from government police forces and the military itself, but also private militaries hired by robber barons in order to crack down on their populations and keep them in line. People during the labor movement used rifles, pistols, explosives, and a whole hell of a lot more to even the playing field in the face of tyranny. A more recent example, you can consider the Oka crisis of 1990 up in Canada. Some indigenous folks there had a little bit of territory they had managed to retain despite the onslaught of colonization, and it was right near the place called the township of Oka. the people that lived in Oka decided it was their God-given right to expand their golf course into indigenous sacred land. Naturally, the indigenous people had some negative feelings about this, and because they had a healthy complement of SKSs and AK-47s, they managed to hold off the Canadian government for upwards of 90 days and caused such a fuss that forest is still there to this day. The golf course was never built. I bring all of this up to try to bring diversity to the perspective that the right to access weapons, in my opinion, is a human right as much as I view healthcare and housing as a human right. I think it is critical because we live in a world that is characterized by domination. You can also think of the people in Bougainville who had a copper mine on their island that was poisoning their water system and degrading the quality of life very severely for the people that live there. And the company, of course, could not be bothered to care. And so, at first, with improvised weapons, bows, arrows, sticks, rocks, whatever they could get their hands on, they started to fight back, and eventually they got their hands on some weapons. And when they started to get their hands on some weapons, and by weapons I mean guns, they started to have a much more effective insurgency, and things snowballed to the point where that mine has been closed down. This, I believe, is called the Coconut Revolution, in a reference to the fact that they managed to refine coconut oil into a biodiesel and run the equipment left behind by that company to give themselves a fairly sustainable, fairly modern type of society. It's important to bring these things up because often when Americans on the liberal or conservative end of things talk about the right to bear arms, they have a deeply American and deeply white-centric perspective. You talk about the right to bear arms to conservatives, and more frequently than not, they will bring up the American Revolution. And of course, that's an important historical touch point, but it's not the only one, and it's not the most valuable one in my personal opinion, because you can argue that the American Revolution did have a lot of flaws. It was a mostly group of fairly well-off folks revolting against a king to create a system that was better for them and the people that they cared about. That's not to say that it wasn't the right thing to do, but I'm saying it's not quite as compelling, in my opinion, as more blatantly oppressed people revolting against their masters and trying to destroy the idea of having masters. So you have a situation here where there are all these places you can go to have a rich and deeply nuanced discussion about the right to bear arms. Liberals will often counter the American Revolution by saying, one, that was a long time ago. Two, the American founding fathers had no idea what a machine gun is, despite the fact that there were repeating weapons available at the time that they were probably aware of. And also keep in mind that at the time, you were allowed to have all of the weapons that King George was allowed to have, including but not limited to muskets, cannons, ships with cannons, and all sorts of other crazy weapons available at the time. You were allowed at the time to essentially have the same weaponry as the biggest empire on Earth. Things are not that way today. You are able to have small arms and a range of what they call destructive devices based on the appropriate licensure that you gather. So, with that said, they will say you can't possibly think about fighting the American government who has tanks, drones, planes, poison gas, nuclear weapons, cruise missiles, armored personnel carriers, 50 caliber machine guns, and a whole lot more. You can't possibly think about fighting them and winning. I would say, tell that to the Viet Cong. Tell that to the Mujahideen. Tell that to a million other forces around the world that went up against colonial powers with basically just small arms and won. With that said, it's a very oversimplified argument. The Vietnam War, which I referenced just a second ago by saying the Viet Cong, was an unbelievably violent and brutal war where they faced titanic odds and titanic losses to gain the win to drive the American Empire out of their territory. That's not a desirable situation. But what I want to get to really talk about what I think is important about the Second Amendment, specifically in the American context, and how it relates to our Constitution, and specifically the right-wing deification of the Constitution as a supreme document that it will protect us no matter what and needs to be returned to. My critiques of the Constitution have come up a little bit when I talked about how the First Amendment has been subverted by powerful media interests to basically nullify your ability to say whatever you want to say, because the only narrative you will come into contact with are those sanctioned by the corporate oligarch media. And so if all you ever see is what's allowed to be shown to you by the oligarchs, then there's a pretty good chance that it doesn't really matter what you have to say, and it doesn't really matter what you think, and it doesn't really matter how you vote. Because the boundaries of your mind have been determined for you, because we don't want a rich and open dialogue. We don't want critical thought. We want a narrative that we can use to control people. We want, as they say, a population just smart enough to pull the lever, but just dumb enough not to question it. And so that's not great. And so let's bring it back to the Second Amendment. The right to bear arms, meant to secure the liberty of the people, meant to preserve our ability to resist tyranny. How much does that really matter? And I'm asking this as someone of good faith who supports the right to bear arms. How much does that really matter in our national context, where the Constitution, in my view, has failed us? And perhaps we have failed it, and perhaps we failed each other. No matter how you frame it, the Constitution doesn't really do us a whole lot of service anymore. And that, in my opinion, is not a good thing, and that gestures to the Constitution having been inadequate to enshrine the types of liberties that we all deserve. So, again, touching back on what I was just talking about, the Second Amendment guarantees that right to bear arms, and a lot of people make the very dangerous mistake of assuming that the right to bear arms in and of itself is freedom and not a tool to maintain and reassert freedom when necessary. Think about how the Republican Party, who people are really starting to come to terms with the fact that they have been scamming you for decades. They have been lying to you for decades. They have been selling your future out from beneath you to corporate interests for decades. So if this party that has no real care for you as working people also is constantly talking about the right to bear arms as the end-all be-all of freedom, then perhaps there's a question that needs to be explored here. Perhaps the focus on the right to bear arms disguises and disappears its true value and importance. If all you have is the right to bear arms, but everything that you have to defend has already been sold out from beneath you while you were focusing on holding onto your guns, then you've already lost. Then all you have is a bunch of guns and no food. All of you have is a bunch of bullets and no future. Because your First, Second Amendment, Third, Fourth, Fifth, I'm sure, are coming. Because all of your protections have been snuck out from beneath you. You have the wall, but the tunnel's been dug underneath, or the ladder has gone over the top. And so basically what I'm trying to articulate here as best as I can is that it really seems like a bait and switch type of operation, or maybe a shell game type of operation is happening here. You are told that the right to bear arms is the sacred defense of freedom. And focusing on that and talking about how it's the defense of freedom sometimes can lead you to a position where you are not actually maintaining that freedom, where you are not vigilant against the removal of your freedom because you think your guns are your freedom. Your guns are a tool to maintain freedom. And so if we're in a situation right now where the right to bear arms hasn't been enacted by enormous numbers of our population to resist the encroaching tyranny, it begins to beg the question, does it even help us at all? Do we live in the times of the labor movement or the civil rights movement anymore, where the right to bear arms is used in a way that actually matters? I'm not sure. And if we're not sure about whether or not we live in those times where the right to bear arms even matters anymore, what does that mean for your strategies and for your tactics and for the world that you want to live in? the right to bear arms only draws itself as distinct from terrorism if there are enough people around who believe as you do in order to enact a revolt, revolution, armed pressure of some kind, with enough people to actually represent a majority of the population. And if the majority of the population has been so thoroughly lied to, what can you do? What does that mean? I'm asking these questions because I don't have the answers, and I'm not sure you do either, simply because this type of conversation doesn't happen. Unfortunately, all we talk about in the media and in the public discourse is surface level issues, and so we never really get into the nuts and bolts of what is happening and never really explore and articulate what it is that we have and what it is that we've lost and how it is that we can maintain or perhaps even gather back what we lost. If you have the right to bear arms, that allows you to fight for freedom. But if your mind still exists in the company store or in the prison that the oligarchs have built you, your right to bear arms doesn't matter. And maybe that's why the First Amendment is first and the Second Amendment is second. They are both very high up in the Bill of Rights in their primacy toward the defense of liberty. But if number one has been subverted, I'm not sure if number two has any value. And that's not to say that a society that I would want to live in wouldn't have some variation of the right to bear arms. It's saying, has this Constitution not done what it was intended to do because it was subverted so early on? And because it was able to be subverted, does that then make us wonder if the Constitution failed? And that's a very prickly subject, because a lot of people view the Constitution right up there with the Bible. And I think that's very, very dangerous. I think we should view any government document with skepticism. Because at the end of the day, the government is the armed gang that you have allowed yourself to be controlled by and pay protection fees to, like you would with a mafia, but we just accept this one. And so anything that they put out, you should be skeptical of. This country arose from skepticism and resistance to government. So one would have to hope and expect, and perhaps our founders hoped and expected, that skepticism and willingness to resist would always be there. And unfortunately, it's not. Pretty much the only people willing to resist at this point are folks on the extreme right and leftists. Most moderates and most liberals are too busy trying to tweak the system, and most conservatives are too busy shouting down anyone who dares to stand up against their precious system that they are stockpiling weapons against for some reason. This is just one of many points in our society that are very deeply confused and very deeply problematic. And if, like me, you want to have a freer, livable world, and maybe like we discussed in the first segment, a world that isn't consumed by wildfires and drought and famine and dust bowls caused by massive oligarchic corporations refusing to have any sort of accountability on top of our bones, maybe the right to bear arms is important. But just as important is the mind that holds the weapon. And if there's no mind left behind that weapon, or if the mind behind that weapon is just what is essentially a corporate-controlled drone, what is left? What is left? I don't know. I've lived in places where freedom exists, and I've come back here and seen that the things that I was told were freedom are certainly not. They are a cheap imitation. You deserve better, I deserve better, my children deserve better, and your children deserve better. And the sooner we can all get up and realize that our freedom is being ripped away from us at an unbelievable pace while our future is being sold out at an equally unbelievable pace, the sooner we realize that, the sooner we can do something about it. And maybe the Second Amendment will actually have some value again. Maybe it'll be for something more than just fashion statements and collections. Maybe it'll be for something more than just a political talking point. Maybe it'll be a principle that has meaning. Maybe. Who knows? In the meantime, if you have any interest in supporting this show and supporting the shows that I support, you can become a patron on patreon.com/Autonomia, AFTONOMIA. That is Patreon, patreon.com/Autonomia, AFTONOMIA. I certainly appreciate your support and certainly appreciate your listenership. If this exploration of ideas has moved you in any sort of way or has given you something you think might be productive to talk to with another person about, definitely consider sharing it around. I would love to make this conversation as large as humanly possible, and I can't do it without you. Have a great day.
'Cause there's nothing I want more than to sleep under the night sky. The animals as they go about their lives. Feel the fire warm my body, feel the mud under my toes. But tonight the cell keeps me enclosed. For if we don't have our freedom, if we are captured by their iron hands, then the vision for fire, it burns so much more bright. There's no justice in the system, a bigger cage is still a prison. Well, I hope that somewhere someone breaks free tonight.